Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode. So I'm going to be just talking about the what's happened in the news this week, what's going on in politics, state of where the parties are at in polls, and just give my sort of general thoughts on what's going on. So I figured I'd just go back through the politics UK Twitter feed because they normally seem to have like a pretty up to date and consistent like rolling feed on what's going on. Um, so there's been a lot of talk over the last week of the budget, obviously, which is coming out soon, and a lot of people are pretty hacked off because it looks like Labour's going to go back on their manifesto pledge not to increase income tax. Um, they seem to be doing a bunch of other things as well, or considering a bunch of other things like putting a two grand a year limit on how much you can put into your pension before you start paying national insurance. Um, I think again, it's like basically Labour has got this sort of pathological obsession with never cutting spending. Like they just don't. They seem to be just like that. It is they just cannot ever cut spending, no matter how much or how good that spending is on in terms of whether it's the sort of priorities of the people. So you know, people will argue that they don't want to they don't want to see their taxes go up to a lot of people will argue if we want good public services, blah, 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 we have to pay for it, which is fine. But I think broadly speaking, if people knew that their taxes going up would go straight towards those things and I don't know, like more military spending, for example, I think people might be okay with that. The problem is we've got so many things like asylum seeker hotels, foreign aid, all these very stupid climate agreements, net zero, all these things that are just straight up not priorities or even actively things we do not want money being spent on. I think for as long as that's going on, I think it's going to be pretty difficult for them to justify tax increases when these things really should just go completely first. Whether it all adds up and balances the books is a completely different question. But just as a matter of principle, those things shouldn't really be happening at all because if they are, that is basically saying that our taxes are too high. So they can't be increasing our taxes because these things shouldn't be being paid for anyway. Yeah, let's move on to the next thing. So yeah, David Lammy reportedly tells colleagues to refer to him as the deputy prime minister and not by name. I mean that is just I mean, how pompous can you get? I don't know. That really just sums him up. Yeah, let's go on to the immigration. So there's talk that the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, is considering bringing in some Denmark-style changes to the immigration and asylum system. I'm highly skeptical of this. I think there's a few things they might bring in. So you know, more ways for the authorities to like make them pay for the cost of their asylum hotels or whatever. Limiting family reunions, sure. Making refugee status temporary so that once they can be sent back, they will be. And making permanent residency harder to acquire. I mean, I agree with those things, but it's like taking stuff from them to pay for the hotel costs. It's like they shouldn't even be in the hotels in the first place. Like we should, I don't think funny at this point, she just closed the asylum system. It's completely overwhelmed. There's just too many people trying to claim it, frankly, spurious and ridiculous claims. But that's partly a consequence of our system just allowing that in the first place. We just need complete root and branch reform, scrap the whole thing, start again, in my opinion. I just don't see any other way out of this. We have to say anyone who comes by boat will just never be granted asylum. And people talk about, oh, well, if you do that, how else are they supposed to get here? We don't have safe and legal routes. We do have safe and legal routes. The difference is, if you don't qualify for one of those safe and legal routes, the message is loud and clear: do not come. And that's the problem with what the left is saying. Their argument stems from the fact that we're not facilitating people to be able to come when they see them as having a legitimate claim. But their idea of a legitimate claim is, oh, well, they pass the current criteria. But as many of us know, the current criteria is ridiculous. It's too lax. It could apply to literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world. It's just not a way to run an asylum system. It was constructed, and the rules are based on a world that no longer exists. Especially with like the Refugee Convention drafted in the 50s, like that was signed in the aftermath of the Second World War, where Jews had been like systematically genocided. But we don't live in that world. That was at a time where mass movement of people across continents just wasn't really possible in the way it is now. And so, I think we've just got to have a complete rethink about and have a system that's fit for the modern world. Let's move on. Yeah, we obviously had the remembrance, which is which I saw a bunch of left-wing politicians try and shoehorn in somehow Gaza and Sudan as somehow even being remotely relevant, because we have to just oppose all war. Sorry, no, this is a tradition that is to do with us. It's not to do with Gaza or Sudan. And I think it's kind of gross to even try and bring those two things in. So we also had the Telegraph expose on the Panorama documentary to do with the January 6th incident. I think, to be honest, I wasn't actually that surprised about this. It's wrong. It's obviously like, so for anyone who doesn't know, the BBC was basically caught doctoring a clip, or rather they made an edit of a clip. So in the original clip, Trump talks about how they're going to march down to the Capitol. And then around, I think about an hour later into it, or at least 40 odd minutes later into it, he then says, yeah, we'll fight like hell. But he's obviously talking about like politically. And I'm not making an excuse for what happened. It was a pretty ugly event. But they're trying to manipulate people into thinking Trump said something and he didn't. So they spliced two clips together to make it seem like he said, and we'll march down to the Capitol and fight like hell, implying that he was encouraging people to go down to the Capitol and fight, which is obviously not what he actually said and not what he was actually implying. Regardless of whether you think you like Trump or not, that is just objectively wrong. So, in the aftermath of that, Tim Davey resigned and the CEO of the news resigned. I think it's probably the right thing. The BBC has got to change. I think this is really their last chance, to be honest, because if they don't, I think the license fee will have to go, because the reality is we cannot have a situation where the state broadcaster that is funded by us was forced to pay the license fee in order to watch anything. I think, we can't be in a situation where we're forced to pay for something that is just so obviously biased. And we hear a lot of talk about the BBC being biased. You get people on the left say the bias is towards the right, and then the right say the bias is towards the left. And then you get these bizarre centrists who say, oh, well, if that's the case, then it must be doing something right, because if both sides are annoyed, then they're probably, bang on the truth. I'm like, no, that is not how it works, because the bias at the BBC is very rarely overtly left or right wing. Usually the bias is in favor of progressive and globalist stances. So that's why you would typically see, if they had a representative of the Conservative Party, it's almost always, or at least until recently, it was almost always the kind of wet, soppy liberal, pro-immigration, socially progressive types of conservative. These people represent about 10% of the population at most. Like, they are not representative of the broad right-wing voter demographic. But this is how it's always been with the BBC. And so, and it's the same with the left, to be honest. I'm no lefty, but I do kind of somewhat sympathize with them in the sense of it's not as bad as the bias against the right. But typically when you see someone from the left, it's almost always, going to be some complete lackey like MP in the Labour Party who just spouts whatever government line is the one of the day, and they're not really putting anything particularly left wing forward. In fact, I think that, again, this is kind of part of the problem with with immigration. Immigration is like framed from a BBC perspective as being a right wing issue, but typically that is not how it used to be. You know, the left used to be the ones who understood that high immigration was detrimental to the living standards of workers, you know, and their wages. I don't see that as a particularly right wing thing at all. In fact, the right were normally the ones who wanted to boost immigration because they saw it as, you know, making GDP go up, um, which I've never agreed with, even as someone on the right. So, yeah, I think you know, this debate about like bias in the BBC is raging on, but I struggle with it because I feel like the framing of where the bias is completely wrong from most people's perspectives. Um, so yeah, I mean, and Nigel obviously knows Trump, and speaking of Nigel, the Reform had a great event a couple of days ago where I think that they launched Small Business for Reform, and he gave a very impassioned speech about you know, what capitalism really is. And I would encourage anyone to go and watch it because it was honestly one of the best defenses of capitalism I've seen in a long time. You know, he didn't talk about like big corporates. It was really aimed at like the majority of businesses in this country, which are literally run by like a family or, you know, maybe one or two people, and their parents run a small business. You know, it's nobody speaks for them. And the Tories, when they say they're the party of business, normally what that means is they're the party of big corporations and businesses who basically fund them. Reform isn't in that situation. And so I think, you know, this was a really wise thing to do. And it was good because I think, as I said, small businesses account for something like 90+% of the like British economy. I mean, that says it all. The fact that they don't get a fair hearing and they account for so much. Um, well, yeah, let's scroll up and see what's anything else of note. Oh yeah, unemployment today hit 5%, highest level since the pandemic. I mean, is anyone really surprised? I mean, Rachel Reeves was warned that increasing employers' national insurance contributions would have the effect of like dampening how many new jobs there are. And so we're basically in a situation where we don't have new jobs being created, but because of the dire economic situation, people are getting laid off. And then there's nothing for them to go into. So, you know, I really just don't see anything improving. And honestly, this budget with the tax increases is probably just going to make everything even worse. I think, you know, a lot of people I know are basically just writing off this decade already as lost because, you know, even if we get reform in, they're going to have to spend at least a year just unfucking everything that Labour has done to wreck the economy. So, you know, they're not even going to get in till, I mean, even if we do have a snap election or something, it's not going to be for a couple of years. So I really just don't see anything changing anytime soon. And then we've got, we have, for some bizarre reason, decided to suspend some intelligence sharing with America over concerns about the legality of drug boat strikes in the Caribbean. So for anyone who doesn't know about this, America has been engaged in basically drone strikes of suspected drug smuggling on small boats in, you know, across various parts of the Caribbean. There's been some talk of whether they've always got this right or not, and whether they've potentially taken out some civilians. But I think broadly, a lot of people would accept that drug smuggling in that part of the world is extremely prolific, and America is probably within its rights to try and do something about it. Maybe they don't get it right every time, but I just can't see any reason for them not to have a right to go after this problem. And they'll probably get into some kind of protracted conflict with Venezuela and maybe another country over it, you know, because that is where most of this stuff is coming from. And America really just wants to go and get rid of these cartels once and for all. But obviously, as we know, with how corrupt some South American and Latin American countries are, that's going to be quite difficult without practically getting regime change. And then I guess the last sort of story, surprise to no one, the Tories are struggling to fund election candidates. I mean, why wouldn't they be struggling? I mean, they're not coming back in the polls, and if you think they are, maybe 1 or 2% at most, but they're still consistently losing council by-elections to Reform and even a couple to the Lib Dems. So who in their right mind would want to do that? They're going nowhere. Let's go and look at the polling. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag this week for Reform. They had, a couple of days ago, Opinion had a poll that put Reform on 33%. What was quite funny about this was Opinion had, I think they released its poll around 8 in the evening, and earlier in the day, they had said, we've got some big kind of announcement with some sort of striking results for our polling this week. And obviously the Greens, with their recent surge, got very, very excited. It turned out to be nothing. They'd actually gone down. Reform would have boosted 3, but the actual point they were making wasn't even about this particular poll. It was about one saying that most of the country would now say that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer both should resign and have to go. So not quite what people are expecting, but good to see Reform get a little bit of a bump. But I think, the polls are so up and down at the moment, that it's really hard to draw anything in particular from it. And if we scroll up, not a sight I like to see with Reform 26%, but I think it does kind of speak to how sort of all over the place the polls are. They're still firmly in the lead. I don't think there's any risk of them falling into second place anytime soon. But, you have some polls putting them on 26% and then others putting them on 33%. That's quite a wide gap, especially when you consider that most of the other polls have every other party broadly in a similar place, other than the Greens, where sometimes they're on 15, sometimes they're on 18, sometimes they're on 11. So, I mean, this is, again, it's because they've all got their own methodologies. They weight differently based on people who wouldn't vote, maybe undecided. So, yeah, you've got to take it all with a pinch of salt. But I think, broadly speaking, nothing's really changed. I think people are pretty fed up with politics in general. And I just think we've got to wait for the budget to see if that has really any impact on Labour's performance and who kind of is the beneficiary of that. I think Reform could benefit a little bit, but I feel like the Greens could potentially benefit a bit more. And we could be in a situation where you maybe see like Reform on 28% and the Greens on like 20%, potentially. It could be wrong, but I wouldn't be shocked if we start seeing results like that. But yeah, I think that probably covers everything for this week. I'll do another video this time next week, talk about what's changed, what's going on. But if you like what I've got to say, sort of agree with what I'm thinking, let me know down in the comments below. And yeah, but see you next time.